Thank you, thank you. The following is one of my voiceover demos. If you're a voiceover artist and you would like to advertise one of your demos on my podcast, please send an MP3 to thedrill12, all one word, at gmail.com. That's thedrill12 at gmail.com. Back in a minute.
Americans love scenery. We want to see it all, from one coast to the next, Mount Rushmore down to the Everglades. So hop into a Chevy Malibu and take the scenic route. It's the car you knew America could build. There's a place where people count on friendships they can trace back generations, where they can count on the same stool at the coffee shop waiting for them every morning. This place is called Glen Ellen, and you can find it in every bottle of Glen Ellen wine. This is craft brewed Herman Joseph's, the smoothest, easiest drinking specialty beer in the entire solar system. And I believe you'll find drinkable in the dictionary right after don't order a beer you can't drink. Zoingo! Boingo! The freestyle pogo with more boing, more bounce. Bounce further, bounce higher with Zoingo! Boingo! To see what makes Arrowhead Mountain Spring water different from those other waters, you have to go back to the source. And with Arrowhead, that means going back a little farther and longer than most. Between security challenged and security strengthened, there's one important word: how. And it is the how that makes all the difference to our nation and our world. Lockheed Martin. We never forget who we're working for. What makes Kraft Singles so good? 2 out of every 3 kids don't get the recommended amount of calcium. But with Kraft Singles, they get a good source of calcium and the taste they love. Kraft Singles. Magic every single time. Throw boring overboard with a new real meal from Long John Silver's. A meal worthy of a plate, just $4.99. Only at Long John Silver's. We may not all be geniuses, but we can all do something smart. Introducing the Hyundai 199 Sonata Lease. It's a smart deal on a really smart car.
You could do my personal favorite, which is bring up a fight with a coworker from 2004. You guys never reheat some 15-year-old beef in the shower? That's what shower arguments are built for. You're just like, you're always that guy. And then you give them something to say. You're like, I knew you were going to bring that up. I knew it. This is how low my self-esteem is. I lose 50% of my shower arguments. I lose as many as I win. My roommates walked by the bathroom and heard me in the shower alone. Like, you know what? It's a good point. I apologize. I'm sorry. You could do my personal favorite, which...
Good morning. It's Thursday, Bad News Thursday, August the 15th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer, the patriotic song of the day, and the headlines, we will have the patriotic shorts, motivation, Bishop Barron, Ayn Rand, the 33 strategies of war, and bad news. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen.
Lift up your hands, ye heroes, and swear with proud disdain. The wretch that would ensnare you shall lay his snares in vain. Should Europe empty all her force, we'll meet her in array, and fight and shout and shout and fight for North America. Torn from a world of tyrants beneath this western sky, we formed a new dominion, a land of liberty. The world shall own we're masters here, then hasten on the
Thank you. And now, the headlines.
Now, Southern California's news leader, ABC7 Eyewitness News.
Now at 6, some breaking news. Sentenced to a Russian prison for a $51 donation. Lawyers for an LA woman now vowing to fight after an early morning verdict.
It's a hack that could impact every single American. What we know about the group that claims to have stolen the Social Security information for billions of people.
And soon we'll have access to these views as we celebrate the grand opening of the Intuit Dome today. We're live in Inglewood. Well, good morning. I'm John Gregory with Rachel Brown and Marco Robles.
And that was the headlines. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, my take.
Jackie Wilson. Higher and higher goes the Dow. Higher and higher goes Walmart stock. I suppose that's what it's all about. I don't know. It's another beautiful day in New York City. We've had 3 in a row.
I know.
Look at that. Isn't that gorgeous?
And I think 6 in a row for gains on Wall Street. I think today is day 6 of gains in a row.
Yeah. It is?
Believe so.
Oh, higher and higher. There you go.
Yeah.
Excellent. Morning, everyone. 10 o'clock Eastern. We better get to your money. Look at this. The Dow's up 400. The Nasdaq's up close to 300. And the S&P is up 60 points. Almost all of them are up in percentage terms, except the Dow, which is up almost 1%. Look at the 10-year Treasury yield. It's going up this morning, significantly so. That may put a damper on big tech rally, maybe, I don't know. But right now we're at 3.94%, up a whopping 11 basis points. The price of oil, not moving much these days, despite all this tension in the Mideast. 77.98 is your price. Bitcoin, again, not doing that much. Your price now, 59,400. We just received the latest read on home builder confidence. Where's that confidence
going?
Going
To burst the bubble a little bit. It is down 2 points to 39. It was a surprise drop in August. It's down now 4 consecutive months. This is the lowest reading of the entire year. Less than 40% of home builders say conditions are good. Buyers are hesitant. They're waiting for rates to drop further.
Zero impact on the market. That would be the stock market. Not that I can see at this moment, anyway. All right, now this. To solve the inflation problem, Kamala Harris will blame big corporations and then go after them. The announcement came Wednesday night. It's the first hint of what's to come. In her first 100 days as president, President Harris promises new rules so big corporations can't unfairly exploit consumers to run up excessive corporate profits on food and groceries, end quote. That polls well. So go for it, why don't you? That's what they're doing. Don't even try to understand what really caused the huge run-up in grocery prices. Just blame somebody and score political points. Same with drug prices. In the very badly named Inflation Reduction Act, the government will, quote, negotiate the price of up to 20 drugs a year. And if Big Pharma doesn't agree to the negotiated price, they'll have a big chunk of their revenue confiscated. A company that conducts drug trials says there have already been profound cuts to research and development. Far fewer new drugs. Harris wants to put distance between herself and Bidenomics. In the past, she's claimed that Bidenomics is working. Now she's admitting that inflation is a problem, and it is big business that is to blame. This may be politically popular in some quarters, but it's not going to work. Prices are set by the market, supply and demand. When the Biden-Harris team threw nearly $2 trillion into the economy and the Fed printed another $6 trillion, demand was stimulated big time. Bring in all those supply chain disruptions and you get inflation. Harris doesn't want to understand that, so she'll play the blame game. One of her economic advisors is a top aide too, Senator Elizabeth Warren. Oh dear. Warren is a socialist. The new Harris economic plan will likely take another left turn. The second hour of Varney, just getting started.
So I'm on board. If Miss Harris wants to go ahead, Vice President Harris wants to go ahead and go after big businesses, I'm on board with one condition, and that is everybody. She's got to go after all big businesses. That means she's got to go after Disney. She's got to go after Hollywood. She's got to go after the New York Times. She's got to go after CNN. She's got to go after MSNBC. Is she likely to do that? Is she likely to go after the big businesses that are Democrat Party donors? Remains to be seen, but I doubt it. So, but anything she proposes, I got to hear from her and her people, guarantee they're going after all big businesses. Then, and only then, will I be on board. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, the patriotic shorts.
Navy signalman third class Elgin Staples found himself submerged in the warm August waters off Guadalcanal. A Japanese torpedo had ripped a hole through his cruiser, and the only thing keeping him alive was a rubber life belt cinched across his waist. After 8 hours of bobbing among the wreckage-strewn waters, Staples was fished out and saved. On leave and flying back to the States, he noticed that the life belt was manufactured at the Firestone Company in his hometown of Akron, Ohio. Elgin also noticed some serial numbers on the inside, but thought little of it. Back home in Akron, Elgin relived his harrowing tale for Mom, and even showed her the miraculous piece of rubber that saved his life. An ashen look came across her face as she stared at the oil-stained rubber belt. "Son," her voice cracked in a barely audible whisper. "I'm an inspector at Firestone, and this is my inspector number," she said through tears. A mother had put her arms halfway around the world to save her boy. Elgin Staples would live to be 86 years old.
There is speed, and there is speed. Well, the latter is exactly what we are looking at in this episode. You know how conventional military aircraft dispense defensive countermeasures to evade incoming enemy missiles? With a cruise speed of Mach 3.2, this one simply outflew anything the enemy threw at it. It broke a record by zipping from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C. in just 64 minutes and 20 seconds. This aircraft flew so high that it used stellar inertial navigation, since it flew high enough to see the stars. This is the father of the Dark Star hypersonic aircraft that Tom Cruise flew in Top Gun Maverick. We are talking about the mighty SR-71 Blackbird, of course. And the interesting bits don't end here, as this record breaker doesn't have one dull screw on its body. So, buckle your seatbelts and enjoy the flight.
What happens if a nuclear missile is shot down in midair? Let's find out. The main goal of the interceptor is to completely destroy all components of the missile. But curiously, a shoot-down would not result in a massive explosion in the air. When intercepting a nuclear missile, the main goal is to prevent the activation of the nuclear warhead by destroying its triggers before reaching the target. Therefore, without activation, there would be no explosion, even after impact. While the contamination could be problematic, it would be far from as devastating as a nuclear detonation on the intended target. With some luck, one contaminates some farmland, or even better, mountains and forests that aren't really used for much, and the death count could realistically be 0. On the other hand, a hit on a city could kill tens, maybe hundreds of thousands, plus contaminate a greater area than an intercepted missile would have done.
The director of the opening ceremony was fired hours before the event because they found out there was a Holocaust joke in a comedy routine he did decades ago. Well, you know, context is everything. Obviously, it didn't strike people as beyond the pale at the time. Days before that firing, the opening ceremony's musical director was also forced out because someone dug up an interview with him from 1994 where he admitted to bullying classmates as a child. And the creative director of the entire shebang of the whole Olympics got shit-canned because he once made a fat joke in a private conversation. This is called a purge. It's a mentality that belongs in Stalin's Russia. How bad does this atmosphere we are living in have to get before the people who say cancel culture is overblown admit that is in fact an insanity that is swallowing up the world?
And that was the Patriotic Shorts. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, a little bit of motivation.
The reason most people fail is because they give up what they want most for what they want now.
So often the easy path that calls to us to be weak for that moment, to break down for that moment, to give in to the desire and the short-term gratification. But the discipline will not allow that. Discipline means taking the hard road, the uphill road, to do what's right.
Discipline is doing what you said you were going to do when you don't feel like doing it, when you felt like doing it in the first place. That's all it is. When you fell in love with it, you were just like, let's go, let's go, let's go. But then stuff's going to happen. Discipline means that you dominate when you feel like it and you dominate when you don't feel like it.
The discipline calls for strength and fortitude and will. It won't accept weakness. It won't tolerate another breakdown. The discipline can seem like it's your worst enemy. But the reality is, discipline is your best friend. It will take care of you like nothing else can.
It's so easy to put things off. So easy to say, you can do it tomorrow. Well, I want you to reprogram your brain and tell yourself that tomorrow is not a viable option. Tomorrow doesn't work. You do it today. You get it done today. That's what you do.
Tomorrow. Ain't no such thing as tomorrow. We only got today. If you wanted to happen, get your butt up and make it happen. If you wanted to happen, rise and grind.
You've got to outwork, outlast, and outperform the person you were yesterday, becoming better than your past self. When you continue to do that day after day after day, you're unstoppable. You're on a relentless pursuit of excellence, and the only way to get to that point is by disciplining yourself every single day of your life, no matter what.
If you don't improve your skill, if you don't do everything you can, if you don't stop cutting corners, stop taking it easy, stop letting that little voice win the fucking war in your brain that says, tomorrow, I'll start Monday. It's not that big of a deal. Give yourself a break. You work really hard. You deserve this. If you don't silence that fucking voice, you will lose everything. No compromise, no exceptions, ever. That's the test you have to pass in order to earn your way into the life that you desire. It's an opportunity to prove to everyone else, but most importantly, yourself, what you are really made of. It's an opportunity to prove that you're a winner. It's an opportunity to prove you are what you say you are in your head when you look in the mirror. When you look in the mirror and you say, there goes a bad motherfucker, you actually believe it.
I know you're great, and I dare you to be great. I challenge you to be great. I challenge you to be great in every single thing you do. You gotta learn to close your ears to everybody. You gotta learn to close your ears to everything. You gotta learn to block out the distractions, and you gotta learn to get focused, all right? Discipline is you do it so long and so hard, and you're so passionate about it that even when you don't feel like it, you still operate at the highest level.
Embrace the process, trust the process, but most importantly, you gotta respect the process. Talent will never supersede it.
Nothing great comes from a position of comfort. Everything worthwhile, everything that is great comes from being uncomfortable. And if you can get used to being uncomfortable, your fucking limits are non-existent.
It's easier to watch greatness. It's easier to go see greatness than it is to put in the time, to put in the energy, to discipline yourself, to sacrifice. It's easier. And so that's why you average. And so you're frustrated because you're not living like you should live. You can't stay where you are and go where you're trying to go. Many of you love your comfort zone too much. You love it. You love security too much. And I'm telling you, you can stay where you are. You can. But you can't stay where you are and try to go where you're going.
You have to do the things that you don't feel like doing because you know it needs to be fucking done.
I need you to look at yourself in the mirror and say, come on, quit, stop playing. I deserve to see what my life would look like if I gave 120%.
I made my last excuse yesterday. I came up with my last reason yesterday of why I can't do what I'm supposed to do. Oh, I don't feel so good today. Get your lazy, sick ass up out of bed. Your only commitment is to the activity, not to the grand scheme, not to the big picture. It's to do the thing. Everything that's keeping you from doing what you're supposed to do, I need you to put it behind you and say, yesterday was the last day for that foolishness. Yesterday was the last day to say, I don't have enough money to do this. I don't have what it takes. I'm not smart enough. No more defeats. No more defeats, man. You can do it. You can make it happen, but you can't do it procrastinate. All I want you to to do is what you said you were going to do. I want you to stop talking about it. I want you to stop telling people about it and get it done, whether you feel like it or not.
And that was a little bit of motivation. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now it's time for the Daily Stoic.
Anger is bad fuel. There is no more stupefying thing than anger, nothing more bent on its own strength. If successful, none more arrogant. If foiled, none more insane. Since it's not driven back by weariness, even in defeat, when fortune removes its adversary, it turns its teeth on itself. Seneca, on Anger, 3.1.5. As the Stoics have said many times, getting angry almost never solves anything. Usually it makes things worse. We get upset, then the other person gets upset. Now everyone is upset, and the problem is no closer to getting solved. Many successful people will try to tell you that anger is a powerful fuel in their lives. The desire to prove them all wrong or shove it in their faces has made many a millionaire. The anger at being called fat or stupid has created fine physical specimens and brilliant minds. The anger at being rejected has motivated many to carve their own path. But that's short-sighted. Such stories ignore the pollution produced as a side effect and the wear and tear it put on the engine. It ignores what happens when that initial anger runs out, and how now more and more must be generated to keep the machine going, until eventually the only source left is anger at oneself. Hate is too great a burden to bear, Martin Luther King Jr. warned his fellow civil rights leaders in 1967. Even though they had every reason to respond to hate with hate. The same is true for anger. In fact, it's true for most extreme emotions. They are toxic fuel. There's plenty of it out in the world, no question, but never worth the costs that come along with it.
And that was the Daily Stoic by Ryan Holiday. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Bishop Robert Barron.
I'll speak as a Catholic. We lost confidence in ourselves. Our game became so much, let's make ourselves pleasing to the culture. You know, when I was a young guy, it's reaching out to the culture, making sure the culture understands, and let's use the culture's language. We lost confidence in ourselves. And honestly, the culture wasn't that interested in us. You know what I'm saying? They weren't reaching back to us. They were like, oh yeah, great, as we move on. Where the church ought to say, no, in season and out, no matter where the stupid culture is, we proclaim Christ, and we proclaim right praise. This, culture that we're all trying to mollify, it's the priests of Baal. And there are 450 of them, right? I mean, they always outnumber us. There's one Elijah, but by God, he was the right prophet. But there are 450 priests of Baal. They're all over the place in the culture. Why are we pandering to that culture as our primary move? We should be...
And that was Bishop Robert Barron. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the Ayn Rand thought of the day. Quote, envy is regarded by most people as a petty, superficial emotion, and, therefore, it serves as a semi-human cover for so inhuman an emotion that those who feel it seldom dare admit it even to themselves. Today, that emotion is the leitmotif, the sense of life of our culture. It is all around us. We are drowning in it. It is almost explicitly confessed by its more brazen exponents. That emotion is hatred of the good for being the good, unquote. And that was Ayn Rand, The Age of Envy, from the book Return of the Primitive. Back in a minute. Thank you, thank you. Now, the 33 strategies of war.
By Salvador Dali. If you decide to wage a war for the total triumph of your individuality, you must begin by inexorably destroying those who have the greatest affinity with you.
And that was the 33 Strategies of War by Robert Greene. Back in a minute. Thank you, thank you. If you're a Democrat, you should vote Republican because today's society increasingly divests itself of the negativity of the other or the foreign. The process of globalization accelerates the dissolution of borders and distinctions. Yet, the depletion of negativity should not be equated with the disappearance of violence, since along with the violence of negativity, there's a violence of positivity, which is wielded without enmity or domination. Violence isn't merely an excess of negativity. It can also be an excess of positivity. The accumulation of the positive, which manifests as overachievement, overproduction, overcommunication, hyperattention, and hyperactivity. The violence of positivity is possibly even more disastrous than that of negativity because it is neither visible nor evident, and it evades immunological defense because of its positivity. Infection, invasion, and infiltration, which are characteristic of the violence of negativity, now give way to infarction. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now a little bit of Maria Bartiromo, and she's talking to a guest who's giving some advice about the presidential race.
He's having a press conference today at 4:30. He should do more of that. You don't win on insults, you win on insights. You don't win on personalities, you win on policies.
So there, and that is Kellyanne Conway, or whatever her name is. And she's advising basically Trump, saying, chiding him for insulting and whatnot. And she doesn't realize that she's absolutely wrong. This is where the Republicans make the mistakes, not only make mistakes, they do the same damn mistakes over and over again. Human to make mistakes, stupid to repeat them. And she's just stupid. It is not winning. You don't win on policies. We like to convince ourselves that we win on policies, that if you win, then that's a mandate for your policies. But the fact of the matter is, the way this is set up is it's all about popularity. People are elected because they're popular. That's all there is to it. It might be something... I remember Ronald Reagan. There was somebody, a Hollywood actor, that said he was going to vote for Reagan because he said anybody that's over the age of 70 who doesn't have any gray hair gets my vote. Okay, that's it. That's all you need to do. There's no qualifications to run for president other than be over 35 years of age and be a natural-born American citizen. That's it. The rest of it is just popularity. You don't have to be the smartest. You don't have to have the best ideas. You just have to be popular, more popular than the other person. And if these idiots in the Republican Party like Kellyanne Conway would finally get it through their heads that that's what this is about, then they would concentrate on that. Look at what happened with Elon Musk, he and Elon Musk. Donald Trump, 1 billion viewers. 1 billion viewers. How many people have wanted to see what it is that Kamala Harris has to say? Nobody. Nobody cares what she has to say. It's the popularity. There was that slogan from the Clinton race, it's the economy, stupid. No, it's popularity, stupid. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, bad news. Chapter 4, Abandonment of the Working Class.
Chapter 4, The Abandonment of the Working Class. In an editorial published 1 month after Donald Trump's surprise election win in 2016, the New York Times lamented the breakdown of a shared public reality built upon widely accepted facts. waxing nostalgic for the days when everyone, on the left and right, would tune in every night to watch Walter Cronkite deliver the news on CBS, the Times editorial cast Trump as a fabulist immune to facts. Without people like Cronkite, or president and other politicians who care about the truth, media organizations that report fact without regard for partisanship, and citizens who think for themselves will need to light the way, the Times concluded. There is a deep irony in the Times trying to reclaim Ox's goal of providing the news without fear or favor at a time when 91% of New York Times readers identify as Democrats. 91%! Moreover, the Times played a significant role, perhaps unintentionally, in the breakdown of the Cronkite consensus era and the compartmentalization of the news into left and right. A closer look reveals that the real dichotomy is not political at all. It is based on class. For in the past 50 years, the rest of the news media began to emulate the business model of the Times, restricting its audience to an ever more elite group and very consciously excluding the poor and working class. And in so doing, they opened up the lane for conservative media to step in and clean up. As we will see in this chapter, the defining feature of conservative media is not that it endorses conservative politics, but that it stepped into a class lacuna created by the mainstream press's abandonment of the working class. The truth is, the so-called golden age of consensus was shorter than we think. By the time Cronkite had assumed his position as the host of CBS News in the early 60s, the mainstream media around him was already abandoning the consensus approach it had assumed during World War II. That consensus took shape in the midst of a national crisis, which always tends to unify people around shared values. The consensus that allowed Americans with different values and political orientations to get their news from a shared source was, in fact, kept alive not so much by a political agreement as by an economic reality. The 2 decades between the mid-40s and the mid-60s were a time of buoyant social mobility. Working class wages rose steadily and significantly, so much so that the very idea of working class was almost an anachronism, given how little distinguished the working class from the middle class and even from the rich. As New York Times columnist Ross Douthat and Manhattan Institute president Rehan Salam wrote in their 2009 book, Grand New Party, in an age of cultural equality, when the rich drove almost the same cars as everyone else, ate roughly the same food, and watched exactly the same television shows, for the working man, there seemed to be hardly anyone above him worth envying. This economic fungibility meant that media outlets were catering to a mass audience that included both the upper classes and the much larger lower ones, in addition to Republicans and Democrats. To maintain the widest audience possible, publishers and editors put a premium on keeping the news straight, telling readers what happened and letting them decide for themselves what it meant. There were also a limited number of FCC licenses, and those licenses were bound by the Fairness Doctrine, which required outlets to present issues of public importance in a way that was balanced. Altogether, this resulted in a journalism that was deeply committed to the difference between opinion writing and straight news, a journalism produced often by men with little to no education — it was always men back then — whose focus was on the who, what, when, where, and how. The why was beyond their purview, writes Matthew Pressman in his book On Press, The Liberal Values That Shaped the News. All that began to change in the 1960s. We've already seen how the class of journalists began to shift upward. Alongside this shift came another shift in how they and their bosses viewed their readers. America was going through a knowledge explosion, and media companies knew it. As the New York Times executive editor put it, the typical reader is much better educated, his interests are more sophisticated, his tastes are more likely to be international, he has a grounding in culture which the older generation did not have. The educational chasm that has come to define American life today had already started to emerge by that point, and newspapers quickly chose a side. Newspapers must throw away old definitions of what makes news, petty crime, local fires, the chit-chat which provided so much of the stuff of our father's newspaper, the executive editor said in a 1965 speech about the future of journalism. He went on, Today, the prime subjects of news are those which are on the frontiers of man's expanding knowledge. Cybernetics, the new mathematics, the structure of the chromosome, the deep philosophical and religious implications of man's expanded universe, the tidal movements in human relations, such as we have witnessed in the civil rights struggle in this country, the complex splintering and elaboration of Marxism in many parts of the world. You can see how the topics that top executives wanted covered had a lot more to do with the class of the reader than with their political orientation. But you can also see how tightly one of the political orientations came to be associated with a certain level of education. Already in 1965, the complex splintering and elaboration of Marxism could be listed along with mathematics and the structure of the chromosome as the kind of subject the New York Times reader cared about. Naturally, the move away from crime in City Hall and toward stories about mathematics and cybernetics meant that a higher class of reporter was necessary to cater to this higher class of reader. After all, reporters were now being asked not to interview people and tell readers what they learned, but to interpret what they learned in essay-length articles about cybernetics. A generational shift swiftly took place, as we saw in the last chapter, away from journalists who saw the work as a blue-collar trade and toward journalists who came from increasingly elite colleges. And instead of poaching journalists from smaller local papers, as they had once done, the big papers began poaching them from each other, writes Pressman in On Press. It took all of 20 years for the stories on the front pages of the nation's major newspapers to go from being descriptive to being analytic and interpretive, a shift that began in 1954 and was completed by 1974. Senator Joseph McCarthy's witch hunt gave this shift the justification it needed. By reporting his invented accusations of communism, reporters were amplifying his charges. The lesson many liberal journalists learned from the episode was that it was important not just to report the facts, but to interpret them. That this interpretation would inevitably have a liberal bent was not the goal so much as it was a byproduct of their sociological makeup. The shift from description to interpretation was not without its critics, including on the left. James S. Pope of Louisville's liberal Courier Journal decried the Frankensteinish copy that intermingled the writer's personal notions with the facts. And John Oakes, the editorial page editor of the New York Times, wrote a letter in 1963 to his cousin and Times publisher, Punch Sulzberger, decrying the shift. He felt that the news side was encroaching on his territory by becoming increasingly opinionated. I suppose I am butting my head against a stone wall. But again, I feel I must call your attention to the editorialization in the news columns, which, in my view, is steadily eroding the Times' reputation for objective news reporting. He was ignored. But the shift was as much about class and education as it was about political orientation. When the Los Angeles Times wanted to compete with the New York Times, hoping to gain national prestige, its top editors knew what they had to do, switch from being conservative to being liberal. As Nick Williams, the editor-in-chief of the LA Times, put it, newspaper prestige, not always, but usually, is a function of liberal estimation. Most intellectuals are liberal, and editorial prestige depends on what intellectuals judge it to be. In fact, this slippage from a question of class, coveting the esteem of intellectuals, to one of political orientation, shifting left to acquire that esteem, was one that both liberals and their critics would make again and again in assessing the American press. Spiro Agnew, for example, excoriated the press for its liberal biases, and though he often exaggerated, he was correct in his assessment that the press was paying more attention to dissenters than it had in previous decades, writes Pressman. But it was doing so as much out of class solidarity as it was out of a sense of political bias. It was, after all, a question of class that turned the news from straight to interpretive. And it was a question of class that predicted the liberal slant of most newspapers in the wake of this revolution. Nothing is a better predictor of liberalism than whether or not you have been to college. This is not to say that there were no conservative reporters or columnists, although as we saw in the last chapter, journalists have overwhelmingly tended to be liberal. Newspapers away from the coasts and smaller cities had many more conservative opinion writers, and conservative columnists were syndicated more widely than liberal ones. But the most prominent papers were overwhelmingly liberal, and not just in their opinion pages. By 1970, many young journalists, and some not so young ones, simply did not believe in the notion of objectivity, writes Pressman. Far from considering it journalism's noblest principle, they believed it was foolish at best and deeply harmful at worst. As in so many other aspects of this story, it wasn't entirely the fault of the journalists themselves. As we saw in the first chapter, newspapers in the first half of the 20th century had been central to American life. Most Americans felt they needed a daily newspaper just as they needed heat, electricity, and telephone service, writes Pressman. This was no longer true in 1964, the first year most Americans said they got their news from television. As a result, newspapers needed to sell themselves to readers, not as a utility, but as a desirable product. And because the customer was conceived of as an upper-middle-class white person, that's who the product catered to. If newspapers once saw their readership as the mass citizenry of America, they now began seeing their readers as a self-interested customer base who judged government by how it served them and how it made them feel personally. To cater to these customers, newspapers exploded with service journalism, restaurant listings, shopping guides, and doctor rankings, geared, of course, to those who could afford the products discussed: entertainment, food, high-end shopping. Sections that had once been jettisoned and devoted to women's issues were expanded. An LA Times bumper sticker summed it up nicely in 1978. News, fashion, sports, stocks, travel, humor. It all comes together in the Times. And all of this was done with an eye to advertisers. This shift did not go unnoticed. A scathing critique of the New York Times ran in Harper's Magazine in 1977, arguing that the Times ignored what was going on in the Bronx and spent its time on gold-plated goblets and $90 brass candlesticks because neither Bergdorf Goodman nor Cartier has anything to say to welfare mothers in the South Bronx. The obsession with white, well-off, upscale readers, people of influence and affluence, meant that newspapers began to expand into the suburbs rather than having anything to do with the working-class residents of their own cities. As the editor-in-chief of the LA Times put it bluntly, "We don't sell any papers in Watts." And as is always the case, this question of who newspapers were selling to influenced what they were writing about. Asked why his paper failed at covering communities of color, Otis Chandler, the publisher of the LA Times, said, "We couldn't get the advertising to support that because the mass black audience and the Chicano audience do not have the purchasing power that our stores require to spend additional money in the Times." Of course, this meant there was also little room for journalists of color from the point of view of most papers. Black and female journalists were mostly excluded, and when they weren't, they were treated atrociously. The metropolitan editor of the New York Times, Abe Rosenthal, admitted it was a problem, but claimed that black journalists have not been getting the training or the education that you have to have, white or black, to be a reporter on the Times. In other words, it was a lack of elite education, a question of class, that resulted in the Times refusing to hire black journalists. Meanwhile, coverage of the civil rights struggles across the nation waxed and waned with the appetite liberal white audiences had for reading about them. By 1980, Walter Cronkite's broadcast already represented a nostalgic yesteryear, not because he was apolitical, but because he was still speaking to a mass audience that included Americans of all classes. In No Longer Newsworthy, How the Mainstream Media Abandoned the Working Class, Christopher R. Martin, a professor of communication at the University of Northern Iowa, chronicled what he calls the class-based redlining of the news audience, which began in the 1960s and persists to this day. A lot of it took place on the business side of things. Since the 1920s, city papers had been merging into larger conglomerates, but the rise of television in the 1960s meant an even stiffer marketplace for newspapers, and across the country, papers began to consolidate, leaving most cities with just one paper. This had a number of effects on the coverage. For starters, the modern big city newspapers became big businesses, which meant that their owners shared the values of other big businesses, as Henry Raymond and Adolph Ochs once did. As Daly points out in Covering America, big publishers were almost unanimous in their support for the Republican Party and in their opposition to the income tax, labor unions, and competition from other papers. And as the owners of big businesses, publishers often had a yen for a monopoly and a penchant for buying up the competition, another factor contributing to one-paper towns across the United States. While this gave publishers an inordinate amount of power, it also meant that if they leaned too heavily to the right or to the left, they would sacrifice 50% of potential readers. Over the second half of the 20th century, there would be a huge corporate consolidation of mass media into 5 major media companies. In the new media monopoly, Ben Bagdikian shows how 5 global firms came to own most of the newspapers, magazines, book publishers, motion picture studios, and radio and television stations in the United States, with 45 interlocking directors between them. This, like so many other developments, resulted in a massive collective shift from the Pulitzer model of seeking the widest mass audience possible to the Ox model of seeking the most exclusive audience with whom to court high-end advertisers. The specific reason for this shift was because consolidation meant chains, and chains meant publicly traded corporations that answered not just to readers and advertisers, but to stockholders. With an eye on maintaining high levels of revenue, many in the 20 to 40% profit return range, the mantra for newspapers in the 1970s and onward was to be more market-driven, consumer-oriented rather than citizen-oriented, writes Martin in No Longer Newsworthy. After all, a market-driven product is always looking for an upscale market, and the larger the corporate parent of the newspaper, the more likely it was to adopt market strategies to target upwardly mobile consumers, Martin found. Of course, even the mass market papers had never been truly inclusive. In the leading trade journal for the press, editor and publisher, where publications would advertise their reader demographics to attract advertisers, the 1930s and 40s saw newspapers boasting a clientele that was 94.7% native born or 93% white. They often sought to exclude black readers, discriminating against them on behalf of advertisers whose racist clients didn't want black customers. And in the late 60s, the papers extended this ban to the working class. Less desirable customers now included people who weren't in the upper half of the market, who couldn't afford to move to wealthy suburbs. By the 1970s, newspapers were separating out the reading public into categories based on lifestyle and writing off those who weren't affluent enough. And of course, this intersected with race. The Washington Post cut back circulation to black neighborhoods in the 1960s in order to upgrade the quality of its demographic audience profile, as the paper saw it. Other publications cut subscriptions to rural areas and to working class sections of the city, rationing circulation, as they put it. By literally cutting off working class readers, newspapers could boast to advertisers that their readers were upscale. The New York Times, of course, had a head start on this, having always used this model. And you can see it clearly at work in an ad the Times placed in editor and publisher in 1940 to attract advertisers, which presented potential clients with 2 families, the John Smiths and the Tom Browns. The Smiths were the undesirable and primitive working-class readers of other papers, while the Browns were the upwardly mobile, affluent readers of the New York Times. According to the ad, the Browns, having more money, spend more money on everything than the Smiths, even on everyday items such as food, tobacco, or the corner movie. They buy more and buy more often, and thus are better and more profitable customers. That's why we call families like the Browns the profit half of New York. They were logically the first families advertisers want to reach in New York, and the New York Times, concentrating among them, is logically the medium through which to do so. The ad ran as a series, and each iteration showed the Browns in their natural habitats, juxtaposed with the Smiths in theirs, with each family's shopping lists, picnic baskets, and homes drawn for maximum contrast. In one ad, the Browns stand in the foreground, laughing in evening wear, the husband in a tuxedo, the wife in a feathered gown. In the background, the Smiths amble along in much dowdier outfits. The Browns spend 4 times as much for fun as the Smiths, reads the ad. Of course, it wasn't just the Times. The New York Sun in 1940 claimed that it attracted the readership of the worthwhile buying families throughout New York's good home areas in cities and suburbs. Benjamin Day must have turned over in his grave. The New York World Telegram announced its readers as Manhattanites of the higher rental areas, the world-envied group which works hard at play because it can really afford to. Are we in danger of becoming the rich man's paper? The Los Angeles Herald-Examiner asked in a 1970 ad that ran after a strike at Hearst, its parent company, was ended when Hearst brought in replacement workers and Pinkerton security guards. The answer, also in the ad, is a proud yes. By the 1970s, the New York Times had shifted from boasting the affluence of its readers to boasting about their education. The New York Times will enlighten, expose, expound, confound, explore, suggest, contest, probe, prod, praise, and otherwise provoke and inform now more than ever before, reads an ad the Times placed in editor and publisher on September 19, 1970. Two other ads placed by the paper in 1970 show the New York Spenders, featuring an expensively, understatedly dressed woman in an antique shop, and the New York Smarties, three men playing squash, for which it added the caption, 2/3 of them have attended college. More than 500,000 hold postgraduate degrees. They're the people who read the New York Times. So it's ironic, to say the least, when mainstream journalists, especially those at the Times, lament our information silos and how divided we are as a nation into different news audiences by political orientation. After all, the national news media made a conscious decision to unsubscribe poor and working class Americans. They did not want their business, and they signaled that not through circulation, but through content. To make sure advertisers knew who their readers were, and to signal to readers who their readers were, the media stopped talking about the working class, stopped addressing their issues, and stopped representing their lives. Labor coverage, which used to be robust, was phased out and all but disappeared. Where newspapers used to cover transit strikes from the point of view of striking workers, they started covering them from the point of view of inconvenienced, disgruntled customers, feeding a class divide and an us versus them mentality that pitted the solidarity of the working classes against the individualism of upwardly mobile office workers. The consumer-oriented frame communicated a new sense of privilege for the transit passengers, giving them the implicit permission to express their irritation, annoyance, anger, and disgust at a labor dispute, writes Martin. Instead of labor coverage, you got the workplace feature column, aimed at upwardly mobile office workers and filled with gossipy tidbits and advice about office parties, inter-office relationships, expense accounts, and how to give a good interview, with titles like A Field Guide to Spotting Office Jerks and Panic at the Office Party. No doubt these kinds of articles have a place in a healthy media ecosystem, but they would become the only areas of labor covered by journalism, together with extensive business coverage and investment advice, even though office jobs only represent a fraction of the U.S. labor force, while there are 64 million American workers who earn less than $15 an hour. These people have been left with no coverage at all. People who are not affluent seldom see stories about their day-to-day pains and pleasures and have little reason to buy a daily paper, writes Bagdikian. As a result, the daily newspaper has become a medium for the middle and upper classes. And while the decisions that led to this shift in coverage weren't entirely the fault of individual journalists, they were implicated in them. Already by 1971, less than half of journalists, just 39%, told pollsters that it was extremely important to focus on news that's relevant to the widest possible audience. By 1992, just 20% of journalists believed that. By 2013, it was a scant 12%. And this shift in media coverage had real-world consequences. Beginning around the early 1970s, there was a wholesale shift in political rhetoric about people and their social economic status, writes Martin. The public went from being valued as citizen workers whose productivity created the U.S. economy to consumers in an economy led by Wall Street and business entrepreneurs. And these consumers needed someone to tell them where and how to spend their money. Thus, in the 1960s, 2 more magazines cropped up specifically for the purpose of promoting class through taste: the New York Review of Books and New York Magazine. These publications were explicitly designed to, by turns, stoke and allay class anxieties of urban college grads living in fear of not knowing what the book of the moment is, or where the right place to eat is, or what wine to order, thereby losing their claim to elite status. And of course, it was all aspirational. You had to make sure people felt there was somewhere they were still excluded from, so they would buy the next issue. In other words, the news media helped drive our huge class divide. As Martin explains, when U.S. newspapers deemed the working class no longer newsworthy, they helped create the situation they would eventually chronicle for an upscale audience: the increasing economic and political division of the United States. Working class people, urban and rural, white and people of color, were left without a journalistic voice in public life, while middle-class people and the more affluent were treated to journalism that overstated their activities, overrepresented their numbers in the community, and over-catered to their interests. Needless to say, working-class Americans stopped reading these publications, and without a working-class readership, the liberal media has leaned ever more heavily on upper-class readers, viewers, and listeners. Just 7% of people who consider the New York Times their main source for news have a high school degree or less. Only 8% of loyal NPR listeners have not gone to college. 62% of public radio listeners earn more than $75,000 a year, and 77% own their own homes, one public radio station reported in 2014. New York Magazine boasts 2,224,000 affluent magazine readers monthly, 76% of whom have a household income of $150,000 or more. The Wall Street Journal reports in its media kit that 4 out of 5 readers have a bachelor's degree or higher, and half are affluent, meaning they own liquid assets of $1 million or more. In a now deleted media kit, the New York Times boasted a print readership who were elite, affluent, and influential, more likely to be millionaires, C-suite executives, or business decision makers than the average affluent adult, and claimed a median household income of $191,000, with digital readers coming in at $96,000. In other words, class plays a huge role in how publications see themselves and their readers. But though this information is front and center for publications, it's been completely erased from the national conversation about the media, which tends to focus on political polarization. That polarization is, of course, also there. Of those people who identify Fox News as their main source for political news, 93% are Republicans, while 91% of people who identify the New York Times as their main source are Democrats, according to the Pew Research Center. But just as important, yet hardly discussed at all, is the question of class. Something that's never mentioned is how the liberal mainstream news media has actively excluded the working class, even the idea of being working class, from its pages. Well, nature hates a vacuum. So apparently does Rupert Murdoch. And with a huge mass market just there for the taking is exactly what he and others did. To liberals, conservative media is one big trash heap of racism and lies. Headlines in liberal news media outlets routinely associate Fox News with fake news. Throughout the Trump administration, journalists from elite media outlets frequently derided Fox News as state-run media or party press, and they continue to accuse the channel of spreading dangerous misinformation. These characterizations often deploy colorful fantasies of infection and even cannibalism. You know all those awful gifs using a Meryl Streep line from A Cry in the Dark? A dingo ate my baby? Well, it sometimes feels like Fox News is eating my mother's brain, wrote one New York Times contributor. But though the New York Times may claim that talk radio is turning millions of Americans into conservatives, the truth is almost certainly the opposite. Conservative media is conservative because it caters to the working class, and not the other way around. As Chris Arnade, the author of Dignity, Seeking Respect in Back Row America, explained it, media outlets that cater to the working class are those that eschew the national for the local, and there is a great degree to which conservative values and what he calls localism overlap. Localism means a lot of things, but foremost to me, it is about valuing non-credentialed forms of meaning like place, faith, and more natural institutions like family and smaller community centers, Arnade explained. While many wealthy Americans hold these values dear, they unite the economically diverse, non-college educated portion of our nation under a common cultural rubric. And it's this that's reflected in our polarized media more than politics as such. You can see this in the viewer demographics of media outlets. In 2012, the Pew Research Center ranked the incomes of the news audiences of different outlets and television shows. What it found was staggering. At the top of the list, after consumers of papers that cater to financial elites, The Economist and the Wall Street Journal, are consumers of all the liberal outlets and shows. NPR, The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Daily Show, The Rachel Maddow Show, and The Colbert Report. At the bottom of the list are consumers of Fox News and daytime radio talk shows, the kind of shows you can listen to while you work with your hands. Audiences for Limbaugh, Hannity, and O'Reilly are somewhere in the middle of the pack due to their ability to attract both rich and working-class conservatives who are united not by any economic status, but rather by a cultural one, a shared anti-elite sensibility. There is an even more stark breakdown when it comes to educational achievement. Just 29% of Limbaugh's audience and 24% of the Fox News audience had graduated from college. 54% of daytime talk show listeners had only a high school degree or less. Meanwhile, the audiences of the liberal publications rank at the top of the educational attainment scale. And while back in 2012, CNN and MSNBC ranked near Fox News, by 2019, this would no longer be the case. In 2012, The New Yorker, The New York Times, and NPR were among the outlets with the most highly educated audience, a trend that has only gotten more extreme since then. It makes sense after all. Conservative talk radio is the perfect companion for long-haul drives across the country in a truck, or for keeping your mind occupied on a factory floor, or if you're a car mechanic working under the hoods of cars all day long. Back in the day, factory workers on the Lower East Side would appoint one of their ranks as the reader. The readers would read aloud from Yiddish newspapers and sometimes poetry and novels to the millions of Jewish immigrants rolling cigarettes and sewing shirtwaists 16 hours a day. Today, working-class Americans have talk radio and increasingly YouTube and podcasts to keep their minds occupied while they labor at jobs that don't allow them to sit at a desk scrolling through social media posts of 29 cats having a worse day than they are. Meanwhile, liberal working-class Americans who haven't gone to college don't have a similar media outlet, and it's gotten even more extreme of late. Back in 2012, just 26% of MSNBC viewers had a college degree. Today, 27% of these viewers don't have any college under their belts. 45% are college grads. A similar shift occurred at CNN. The status of the Fox News audience has only increased slightly. What this reveals is that the media is just as polarized along class lines as it is along political lines. As Duthot and Salam wrote in Grand New Party, out of the fracture and chaos of digital media, a broader division emerged, splitting America into two cultures, one highbrow and one lowbrow, one elite and one largely working class, one the culture of the mass upper class, the winners in the meritocratic game, and the other the common culture that the new elite had risen above or deliberately abandoned. And as Nancy Eisenberg has written in her excellent book, White Trash, The 400-Year Untold History of Class in America, as the contempt for white, lower-income Americans grew, so did the self-identification with their rejected cultural identities. Redneck, cracker, and hillbilly were simultaneously presented as an ethnic identity, a racial epithet, and a working man's badge of honor, she writes. It was these people who conservative media identified as an abandoned market ripe for the taking. Roger Ailes, founder of Fox News, who later resigned after allegations that he had sexually harassed staffers and died in 2017, once told an interviewer that his best qualification for his job was that he didn't go to Columbia Journalism School. If I get a job application from someone who went to Princeton or Harvard, they have a harder time selling me, he told his biographer. I'd rather hire state school kids. They hustle. They're not entitled. They have a work ethic, a desire to win, and practical intelligence. There have always been upscale conservative publications like William Buckley's National Review. But throughout the second half of the 20th century, using direct mail, cable television, and talk radio, conservative outlets identified the abandoned working class masses as a ready-made market. And the mainstream media made it easy. Rush Limbaugh portrayed the media as arrogant lefties and out-of-touch elite, and his approach worked because, at least in part, it was true. In effect, Limbaugh was filling the gap that was left when the mainstream media dropped the working class audience, writes Martin. It was a relatively easy turn to make mainstream media the boogeyman. It had, after all, turned its back on the working class in favor of more upscale citizens. This is not to say that Fox News is the inheritor of the populist press, not by a long shot. With a captive working class audience, Fox News could have created a real political constituency, one that demanded dignity in exchange for hard work and insisted that the downward mobility so many Americans face today is unacceptable. As we know, this did not happen. The channel went all in on the culture wars, abandoning the working class's economic interests entirely to unite rich and poor conservative Americans around a cultural front without threatening the status of its rich viewership. Nor does the conservative media have an accurate picture of who the working class is. It's clear they picture their audience as white, rural, Christian, and male, ignoring and even excluding working class people of color. Instead of discussing the merits of things such as an increase in the minimum wage, publicly funded health care, or full support for post-secondary education for working class people, the conservative media focus on abortion, the war on Christmas, not taking a knee during the national anthem at football games, and the evils of immigration, writes Martin. But if the working class in America is an amalgam of cultural and economic factors, the liberal media has abandoned both sides of this equation, while conservative media delivers on one of them. At least Fox News doesn't sneer at working class values while abandoning working class viewers economically. It's true that buried in the appeal to God, country, and family, Fox News has sometimes descended into outright racism. An anchor on Fox and Friends referred to Swedes as having pure genes. Glenn Beck, a former host, accused President Obama of hating white people. The channel also countenanced Trump's racist birther conspiracy theory about President Obama and defended Trump's call for 4 congresswomen of color to go back to the countries they came from for criticizing him. Ailes' genius was for crafting a never-ending us versus them saga in which each news cycle fed the larger narrative. As the liberal elites became more identified with causes like Black Lives Matter, Fox News viewers became more likely to see themselves as opposed to those causes. Rush Limbaugh, who died in 2021, certainly veered into blatantly sexist and racist territory, stoking racial resentment among his working class audience, but also among wealthier white listeners, people with less of an excuse to buy into a narrative of scarcity that pitted them against blacks or Latinos. Further to the right, Breitbart News explicitly and proudly caters to the alt-right, routinely and misleadingly associating people of color with crime, including Muslims, undocumented immigrants, and Black Americans. For years, it had a digital story tag with which to label articles as Black crime. None of this is okay. There is no excuse for overt or covert racism on any platform. In fact, this is something Fox News itself has realized. A writer for its host, Tucker Carlson, was instantly fired when it was revealed that that person had written racist things on conservative social media sites. And Jeanine Pirro was immediately suspended for claiming on her show that Congresswoman Ilhan Omar's hijab meant she shouldn't serve in the U.S. Congress. The truth is, much of the outrage against Fox News for its alleged racism is not for actual racism, but for things that have increasingly been lumped under the ever-expanding category of what counts as racism. Proof of its white supremacy ranges from things like criticizing any person of color, even if they are a member of the U.S. government, and even when the criticism is itself coming from a person of color, to questioning liberal policies and explanations for things, to criticizing the lax immigration laws that have governed this country for so many years. Do racists like Fox News, or does Fox News make people racist? Asked the title of an article that proceeded to cite as evidence for Fox viewers' racism the fact that they were likely to agree that blacks should do as other minority groups had done and work their way up without any special favors. This view is not proof of racism so much as it is proof of the Republican preference that nobody should get any kind of favors from the government. And while it's true that blacks in America have faced unique challenges that many, myself included, feel justify special governmental attention, many black Americans agree with Fox viewers on this question, as we will see in Chapter 7, a fact the article conveniently leaves out. Are they racist too? As we will see in future chapters, many of these critiques reveal a class rather than political bias in the media. But the liberal media and its explicit opposition to conservative media has increasingly used the concept of race to erase the role that class is playing in its good fortune. This is not to excuse any of Fox News' actual missteps, but rather to point out that the majority of its alleged crimes are about class and aesthetics, much more than they are about morality or even politics. The truth is, Fox News is not making anyone conservative. It is conservative because it caters to the working class, a working class long abandoned by the liberal press. And as we will see in Chapter 7, instead of recognizing that the polarization of the media is the result of its own class bias, liberal journalists dressed up their disgust with the working class as heroism. Today, there is no mainstream media outlet left that is doing what Dane Pulitzer did so assiduously, waging a crusade on behalf of the dignity and autonomy of the working class, while also offering it as a product for their consumption. And there's at least an argument to be made that the media's abandonment of the economic concerns of the working class led to their abandonment by politicians of both parties. There's a Talmudic concept of hefker that refers to a thing that's been abandoned and is no one's responsibility. It comes up in the discussion of whether you can keep something you find on the ground or if you're bound to return it to its owner. If the item is clearly hefker, abandoned, the Talmud suggests you can claim it as your own. The media signaled that the working class was hefker, and that no one would make a fuss if their wages stagnated or their jobs were sent overseas. And the people in the position to make these decisions got that message loud and clear.
And that was Chapter 4. And she makes the point that I've been making, that this all started, the split in the media between left-wing journalism, right-wing journalism, all started with the New York Times and their brethren when they started editorializing their front pages. And people noticed that, and they created a vacuum, if you will, that was filled by Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, and company. Back in a minute. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you that you are not neutral and that the government has no rights.